The word he used was liability. Not "it's not working out," not "I need space," liability. Like she was a line item on a balance sheet. Like her dreams were a bad investment he was finally cutting loose. She remembers standing in their kitchen, holding a coffee cup with both hands, watching the steam rise and go still. She remembers thinking, clearly, with a calm that surprised her, that she was going to prove every single word of that wrong. That was the last morning of one version of her life. The version where she made herself smaller to fit inside someone else's idea of what a future should look like. She did not know it yet, but the word he had chosen, the one he had reached for with such casual precision, was not an ending. It was the beginning of the most important work she would ever do. And she would do it entirely alone. Eleanor Voss was 37 years old when her partner of 6 years walked out of an apartment in downtown Chicago with a bag over his shoulder and a look on his face that she later described as relieved. Not guilty, not sad, relieved. Like a man who had finally signed a document he had been putting off for months. She stood in the hallway and listened to the elevator doors close. She stood there for a long time after that. The building made its usual sounds. A neighbor's television, someone's keys in a distant lock, the low hum of the ventilation running overhead. Eleanor did not move. She was processing something that had no good name yet. Not grief, not anger. Something closer to the specific, disorienting quiet that arrives when a noise you have been living with for years suddenly stops. What happened in the 7 days that followed is not a story about revenge. It is not a story about triumph or about proving a point to someone who was no longer listening. It is a story about what a person discovers when every external reason to perform strength is removed. When the audience is gone, the relationship is over, and the only thing left in the room is the question of what they were always capable of on their own. Eleanor Voss had been carrying an answer to that question for years. She had just never been given a clean enough surface to set it down on. The man who called her a liability handed her that surface on a Tuesday morning. He did not know that. He did not know a great many things about her. That was, it would turn out, the most significant miscalculation of his life. There are 3 questions at the center of this story. The first, when the person who was supposed to believe in you becomes the one who gives up first, what does that do to the part of you that still believed in yourself? The second, what is the difference between the person who stops when they are called a failure and the person who treats that word like a starting gun? And the third, the one that is harder to answer than it appears, when everything you built finally speaks for itself, do you still need the person who doubted you to see it? Or have you already moved so far past them that the question has stopped mattering? Eleanor Voss knows the answer to that third question. It took her 18 months, a Forbes feature, and a conversation she never asked for to find out exactly what that answer was. Eleanor grew up in a household in the outer suburbs of Cleveland, where ambition was not a word that came up at the dinner table. Her father, Robert, worked for 31 years at the same shipping logistics company. Her mother, Diane, managed the books for a small dental practice and took pride in the kind of stability that does not make headlines and does not require explanation. They were not unkind people. They were careful people, people who had learned, through the particular education that financial worry provides, that a reliable outcome was worth more than an interesting one. Eleanor understood this. She grew up respecting it. She also grew up knowing, quietly and without ever saying so out loud, that it was not the life she was building toward. She drew plans in the margins of her notebooks in middle school, not plans for anything specific, just the shape of something larger than what she could see from the window of her childhood bedroom. She learned early to keep those plans to herself, not because she was ashamed of them, because the people she loved most did not have the language to receive them yet. And she did not want to spend her energy defending something that had not become real enough to defend. So she built quietly. She graduated with a degree in communications from a state university, took a position at a mid-sized public relations firm in Chicago, and spent 5 years learning every part of the work that the people above her did not have time to explain. By 30, she had developed a specialty, nonprofit communication strategy, an area that most of her colleagues avoided because it did not pay as well and required a patience that commercial clients rarely demanded. Eleanor was not deterred by that. She was, if anything, drawn to the work precisely because it required a longer view than most people were willing to take. She met Marcus Hale at 31 at a fundraising event for a literacy organization she had been consulting for on a freelance basis. He was a financial analyst, self-assured, well-dressed, the kind of man who walked into a room and oriented it around himself without appearing to try. He asked Eleanor about her work with genuine curiosity, or what felt like it. He listened when she spoke. He followed up. He called the next day and the day after that. In the first year, he made her feel like the most interesting person in any room they were in together. She was not unaware of how that felt. She had not felt particularly interesting to anyone in a very long time. She leaned into it. She moved into his Lincoln Park apartment in their second year. She let herself believe that this was what a partner was supposed to feel like. Someone who looked at what you were building and said, "Yes, keep going, I see it." What she did not notice then, and what she would spend considerable time understanding later, was that Marcus's admiration had a ceiling. As long as Eleanor's work remained a secondary thing, a freelance practice tucked alongside a regular job, he found it charming. It added texture to her, made her interesting at dinner parties, gave him something to describe when people asked what his girlfriend did. But the moment the work began to demand more time, more money, more of her focus, more of her emotional energy, his interest did not simply cool. It turned, not dramatically. There was no single moment she could point to. It was a series of small withdrawals, so gradual that she almost normalized each one. A shorter response when she talked about a client. A glance at his phone during the conversation. A shift in how he held his body when the subject came up. A slight stiffening. A micro-expression she would not have been able to name in the moment, but that she cataloged somewhere beneath conscious thought. The dinner she remembers most clearly was in the autumn of her 35th year. She had just signed the largest contract of her freelance career, a national literacy nonprofit, headquartered in Washington, D.C., with a 3-year engagement that would nearly triple her annual revenue. She came home wanting to celebrate. She had a bottle of wine. She had a number she wanted to tell him. She found Marcus at the kitchen island, laptop open, reading something she couldn't see. She told him the news. He looked up. He said, "That's great." He looked back down. She set the wine on the counter. She stood there for a moment. She opened it anyway. She poured herself a glass and sat at the table and drank it alone, looking at her phone, rereading the contract details in her email, telling herself he was tired, telling herself it had been a hard week for him, telling herself the things that were technically possible and emotionally necessary. The wine was good. She finished the glass. She did not pour a second. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And do not forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The argument that ended the relationship was not, by most measures, the worst one they had ever had. It was not the loudest. It did not involve raised voices or anything broken or anything said that required an apology the following morning. It was, in many ways, the quietest conversation they had in 6 years, and it was the one that could not be walked back. Eleanor had prepared for it the way she prepared for client presentations, methodically, with documentation. She had printed a financial projection. She had outlined a 5-year growth plan. She had identified the specific amount she wanted to invest from her personal savings into expanding the firm, hiring her first full-time employee, and moving into a proper office space, rather than continuing to operate from the second bedroom of the apartment they now shared. She set these papers on the kitchen table on a Sunday evening and asked Marcus to look at them. He looked at them. He took his time. He turned the pages with the careful, patient air of a man who had already decided what he thought and was merely confirming it. Then he set the papers back down on the table, aligned them with the edge, and said the things she had not been prepared to hear. Not because it came out of nowhere, but because hearing it spoken aloud made it real in a way that it had not been before. He said he thought she needed to be honest with herself about what the business actually was. He said it was a hobby that sometimes paid for itself. He said he couldn't plan a future around a hobby. He said all of this in a measured, even tone, the tone of a man who believed he was being helpful, who believed he was being the reasonable one in the room. Eleanor did not respond immediately. She remembers the quality of the silence in that kitchen. The refrigerator's hum, a car passing on the street outside, the overhead light casting its flat yellow warmth across the financial projection she had spent 3 days putting together. She asked Marcus, very quietly, whether he believed in what she was building. He said, "I believe in being realistic." She picked up her papers. She aligned them herself. She set them in the manila folder she had brought them out of. She carried the folder back to the second bedroom, the one with her desk and her files, and the whiteboard she had covered in notes that he had never once asked to look at. She closed the door, she sat in her chair, she did not cry, she did not call anyone. She opened her laptop and stared at the screen for a long time, not reading anything on it. That was the night she understood. Something she had been working very hard not to understand. He had never believed in her. Not once. Every expression of support had been a performance of tolerance. He had been waiting, with the patience of a man who considered himself pragmatic, for her to arrive at the same conclusion he had already reached. That this was not going anywhere, and that she should accept it. He was gone within the week. He was efficient about it. Took only what was clearly his, left no ambiguous items behind. Said something on his way out about wishing her well that she could not remember afterward, no matter how many times she tried to replay the moment. She stood in the hallway of the apartment and listened to the elevator close around him. The apartment was fully hers now. The lease was in her name. The mortgage-like quiet of it settled around her in a way she had not anticipated. She had expected to feel crushed by it. She did not feel crushed. She felt the specific, disorienting lightness of a person who has just set down something heavy they have been carrying. For so long, they had stopped noticing the weight. It was not triumph. It was not relief. It was closer to the moment after a long exhale, the brief, clarifying pause before the next breath. She filed incorporation papers for Voss Communications 4 days after Marcus left. She did it at 6:30 in the morning, before the coffee finished brewing, sitting at the kitchen table in the apartment that was now entirely hers. She had a pen in her hand, and the papers spread in front of her, and the first gray light of November coming through the window over the sink. She signed her name. She dated it. She set the pen down and sat with what she had done for approximately 30 seconds. Before she picked the pen back up and started on the lease agreement for the office space she had identified 3 weeks earlier and not yet told Marcus about. She signed too. She had 2 clients scheduled for calls that afternoon. She had a third she planned to contact before the end of the week. She had a list on a yellow legal pad of every person she intended to hire in the first 12 months in order of priority, with notes beside each name. The list had been sitting in the second bedroom drawer since August. She took it out now and set it on the table beside the incorporation papers. She looked at it for a moment. Then she put the coffee on. What followed was not a montage. This needs to be said clearly, because the story gets told later in ways that compress 18 months into a highlight reel that makes it sound inevitable, like a woman who simply decided to succeed and then succeeded. The reality was considerably harder, less photogenic, and more instructive than that. There were clients who did not renew. There were weeks in the first 3 months when the cash flow was tight enough that Eleanor paid her 1 full-time employee and did not pay herself. There was a pitch to a foundation she had spent the better part of 4 months preparing for. A major national foundation. The kind of client that would have transformed the firm's trajectory, that ended in a phone call from the program officer who told her, with practiced courtesy, that they had decided to go in a different direction. Eleanor thanked her. She ended the call. She was in the parking garage beneath the building where she had given the presentation. She sat in her car for a long time, her hands in her lap, looking at the gray concrete wall in front of her. She did not start the car. She let the quiet in. There is a version of hard work that looks like confidence from the outside. Decisive, forward-moving, proof of a person who knows exactly who they are and where they are going. And then there is the version that Eleanor Voss was actually living. The one that happens at 11 o'clock at night in a small office on the second floor of a building in Wicker Park, with a space heater running because the landlord was slow to turn on the heat, and a cup of cold coffee on the desk that she had poured 2 hours earlier and forgotten about. The version that involved rereading the same paragraph of a proposal 4 times without absorbing any of it. The version that involved lying on the floor of that office on at least 3 separate occasions, staring at the ceiling tiles, running through a checklist of everything that could still go wrong. She kept a journal during this period. Not a reflective one, a practical one. A log of decisions made and calls placed and follow-ups needed. When she looks at it now, years later, what strikes her is how little uncertainty shows in the handwriting. Just entries, just the work, just the next thing and the next thing after that. The emotional cost did not always announce itself clearly. It arrived, as these things often do, sideways. She stopped calling her mother as often as she used to. not because anything had happened between them, but because the conversations always circled back to Marcus, to the breakup, to the question of whether she was sure about what she was doing, whether she had thought about what she was giving up. Her mother meant well, she always had. But Eleanor was in a season of her life that required every piece of available energy to go toward the work, and conversations that asked her to justify her choices were a drain she could not afford. She stopped going to the dinner parties she had attended throughout her 30s. She stopped saying yes to things that were not the firm. She became, for a period of about 8 months, a person whose entire life could be described in a single sentence. She worked, and she slept, and then she worked again. The first sign that something was shifting came from a client, not from a spreadsheet. One of the 3 clients she had called in that first week after Marcus left, a mid-sized arts education nonprofit in Milwaukee, sent her an email in the spring. Not a formal check-in, a personal one. The executive director wrote that she had been watching Eleanor's firm grow and had mentioned it to 2 colleagues in her network, and that both of those colleagues had reached out to Eleanor's office that month. Eleanor read the email 3 times standing at her kitchen counter. She set down her phone. She opened the cabinet above the sink and took out a bottle of wine she had been keeping for a reason she had not yet defined. She poured a glass. She stood at the kitchen window and drank it, looking at the street below. She did not call anyone. She just stood there for a few, alone, holding the glass, watching the light change on the pavement outside. Then she went back to her desk and answered the email. By the following autumn, Voss Communications had 7 full-time employees, 11 active clients, and a portfolio of work that had begun to attract the kind of quiet institutional attention that does not make noise until it suddenly, all at once, makes a great deal of it. A journalist named Claire Park had been following the firm's trajectory for several months, initially for a short item in a regional business publication. The item grew. It became a profile. The profile was picked up. The profile was considered for a larger feature. A larger feature was the kind of thing that required a cover. The cover was a photograph taken on a Tuesday afternoon in Eleanor's Wicker Park office, with November light coming through the same window she had stood at on the night she signed the incorporation paper. And Eleanor in the frame looking. This is the word Claire Park used in the action notes, like someone who had been expecting this for a long time and was simply allowing it to arrive. The word Marcus had used was liability. Eleanor has heard it described since then by people who tell her story as a turning point. The moment of maximum darkness before the pivot, the low before the rise. She does not describe it that way. She is careful about this. She says that Marcus's opinion of her was never the engine of anything she did. She did not build the firm to prove him wrong. She built it because it was the thing she had been trying to build for years. And she finally had nothing left in her life that was asking her not to. The departure of someone who did not believe in her was not an inspiration. It was a removal of friction. That is a meaningfully different thing. An inspiration implies that she needed him in order to find the direction. A removal of friction means the direction was already there, and what changed was simply the resistance in the path. She found out about Marcus's reaction through a mutual friend, a woman named Priya who had stayed close to both of them after the breakup and who called Eleanor on a Wednesday evening, opening the conversation with the careful, tentative tone of someone who is not sure whether the information they are about to deliver is good news or complicated news. Marcus had seen the Forbes feature on a news feed. He had looked at the photograph. He had looked at it for what Priya described as a noticeably long time. He had picked up his phone. He had set it back down without sending anything. Priya told Eleanor this with the measured neutrality of someone delivering a fact and leaving the interpretation to the recipient. Eleanor listened. When Priya finished, Eleanor said 3 words, "I know." She did not know, but she also was not surprised. And she recognized, in the moment the words came out of her mouth, that they were completely true in the way that matters more than factual accuracy. She had stopped needing him to respond in any particular way so long ago that his not responding was simply the shape of a silence she had already made peace with. Eleanor still drinks her coffee from the same kind of cup, a wide ceramic one, heavy in both hands, the kind that holds its warmth for a long time. She has a different kitchen now, bigger, with a wall of facing windows and enough light in the morning that she does not need to turn on a lamp until late afternoon in summer. She moved to a different part of the city in the year after the Forbes feature, into a building she chose entirely for practical reasons, loved entirely for irrational ones. There is no empty chair at the table. There is no business plan left on the counter for someone else to ignore. There are, instead, the usual traces of a life built deliberately and without apology. A whiteboard covered in notes, a stack of folders from clients she has worked with for years, a jar of pens on the windowsill above the sink, a legal pad with a list on it that is longer than the one she wrote on the morning she signed the incorporation papers, and will be longer still this time next year. The word liability is a financial term. In accounting, a liability is something that reduces value, a debt, an obligation, a drag on a balance sheet. Marcus Hale used it to describe Eleanor Voss on a Tuesday morning in November in a kitchen in Lincoln Park, with the casual precision of a man who believed he was being honest. He was not wrong about the word's definition. He was wrong about what it described. A liability is something that takes more than it gives. What Eleanor was, what she had always been, and what Marcus had systematically misread as a weakness, was someone whose returns were not yet visible on the timeline he was working with. He was a man who trusted what he could see in a given quarter. She was building towards something that would take years to become legible. He looked at her and saw a deficit. What he was actually looking at was a long-term investment in a period before compounding had made itself obvious. He could not read that kind of chart. That was not her failure. It was simply his limitation. The Forbes cover ran in the November issue. The headline, in the publication's characteristic clean sans serif, read, "The Quiet Builder. How Eleanor Voss Built a Communications Empire One Ignored Pitch at a Time." The photograph showed her standing at the window of her Wicker Park office, hands in her jacket pockets, looking out at the street below with the expression of a woman who is thinking about something specific and will get back to it when the photographer leaves. She approved the photograph. She did not ask for a different one. She later told Claire Park that she looked like she was already thinking about what came next. She is still thinking about what comes next. That has not changed. What has changed? The only thing that can be said with certainty to have changed is that there is no one in the room anymore whose estimate of her worth she has to factor into the calculation. There is no one whose skepticism she carries. No one whose version of practical she has to translate herself into. The room where she does her thinking is entirely hers. The whiteboard is covered in her handwriting. The legal pads are full of her lists. The coffee is always hot because she makes it exactly when she wants it and drinks it at exactly the pace she chooses. It is a small freedom. It is also, she would tell you, one of the larger ones. Some people, when they hear Eleanor's story, focus on Marcus. They want to know whether he ever reached out, whether she would have taken a call from him, whether she ever thought about it, the apartment in Lincoln Park, the early years, the version of the relationship that felt, for a time, like something worth staying in. These are reasonable questions. They are also, in a sense, the wrong ones. Because the story is not about what Marcus thought. It was never about that. The story is about what Eleanor did with the 48 hours after he left, and the week after that, and the 18 months after that, and the years that followed in which she built something that no one else's opinion could have built for her and no one else's doubt could have stopped. The story is about the specific internal resource that activates in a person when all external validation is removed, when there is no audience left to impress, no one is watching, and what they choose to do with the silence. If someone's doubt about you, a partner's, a parent's, a colleague's, ever became the thing that pushed you harder than anything else ever had, we want to hear from you in the comments. Tell us where you are now. Tell us what that doubt cost you and what it ended up giving you, and whether you still think about the person who delivered it, or whether you have moved so far past them that the thought barely lands anymore. And if you are in the middle of that story right now, if the doubt is still fresh, the outcome still unclear, the other side not yet visible, leave that too. Sometimes the most useful thing is simply knowing that someone is listening while you are still in it. In the next story, a man made one decision in 20 seconds. Everyone in his life told him it was the wrong one. A decade later, it turned out to be the only right thing he had ever done. That story is coming soon. If the stories told on this channel stay with you longer than the day you watched them, you already know what to do. Some words are given to us by people who cannot see what we are capable of. Eleanor Voss spent 6 years living inside one man's estimate of her value. When that estimate was finally stated plainly, liability, in a kitchen on a Tuesday, she did not argue with it. She did not beg him to reconsider. She picked up the coffee cup. She waited for the elevator to close. and then she got to work. The most important thing about that moment is not that he was wrong. The most important thing is that she already knew it and had been waiting, with the patience of a woman who understood what she was building, for the room finally be clear enough to prove it.